The New Centers of the Sphere. William Ospina. Colombian writer, novelist, and critic born in Hervio, a municipality in the department of Tolima. The New Centers of the Sphere. The new face of the Latin planet. Not long ago, in Paris, questioned by journalists about how Latin America is defending itself from the cultural invasion of the time, Gabriel Garcia Marquez responded that he did not have so much the feeling that they are invading us, but rather that it is we, Latin Americans, who are culturally invading the world. He added that the way in which the literature, the arts, the music, the crafts, the customs, the gastronomy of our America made their way into the contemporary world was remarkable. It is true, in the times of the so-called Latin American literary boom, whose very name is an expression that it was not a local phenomenon, the presence of our cultures in the societies of the planet was already beginning to be notable, and since then it has become more and more noticeable influence. But since the 30s of the last century, when tango began to be danced in Paris, since the 1940s, when the world of infinite objects and magical libraries of Jorge Luis Borges began to be frequented by the French, when the bands of boleros and Caribbean sounds took their rhythm everywhere, when Mexican cinema began to be seen, and when Pablo Neruda wrote his Residence on Earth and his General Song, since the 1950s, when Pérez Prado's Mambos, Juan Rulfo's narrative and the romantic beginnings of the Cuban Revolution made themselves felt at the same time. And since the 1960s, when Julio Cortázar, Jorge Amado, Mario Vargas Llosa, João Guimarães Rosa, Carlos Fuentes, José Lezama Lima, Alejo Carpentier, Ernesto Sabato, Ernesto Cardenal, Miguel Ángel Asturias and Gabriel Garcia Marquez himself became our greatest writers of the century, and some of them true living legends, the progression has not stopped growing. A phenomenon that occurred, in parallel, became increasingly visible to us, that the plastic arts of Latin America had also been making their way in the Western world, since the times of the great Mexican muralists and the Uruguayan artists Pedro Figueroa Torres Garcia, passing through Frida Kahlo, Remedios Varo, Edgar Negrete, Eduardo Ramirez Villamizar, Armando Rabaran, Soto, Cuevas, Guayas Amin, Desislo, Bravo, Obregon, Caballero, or Morales, among many others, and achieved legendary fame. With names like Orozco, Diego Rivera, Wilfredo Lam, or Fernando Botero. Already in the 1950s, the books of Pedro Henriquez Urena, the great Dominican polygraphist, showed the colossal fresco of a completely interdependent continental literary and aesthetic culture, which included, of course, also Brazil, and also mentioned the excellence of composers such as Carlos Chávez from Mexico, author of notable symphonic pieces, like the Argentine Alberto Ginastera, author of a famous opera inspired by the novel Bomarzo by Manuel Mujica Lainez, or like the Brazilian maestro Heitor Villa-Lobos, whose unusual ensembles of instruments and string quartets have marked an era in contemporary music. But, of course, that presence of ours in the world is more immediately perceptible in the multitude of mestizo faces that fill the cities of the United States, in the Chicanos of Los Angeles, in the Mexican or Peruvian or Cuban food restaurants that abounded in New York and Miami, in the Andean music ensembles that play in the Paris subway, in those boats anchored in the Thames, not far from Big Ben, where swarms of incorrigible Colombians drink brandy and listen to songs of spite, in fact that the television networks with the most audiences in the United States are the so-called Hispanic networks. This is due, equally, to the fact that there are more and more Latin American emigrants, and also to the fact that the process of planetary intercommunication necessarily favors those who have more things to show and say, and Latin American cultural diversity is one of the most notable, though not yet the best known, in the world. These immigrants came in waves to Europe and the United States, Cuban exiles, Mexicans looking for work, Chileans thrown out by Pinochet, Argentines and Uruguayans persecuted by their dictatorships, Colombians expelled by violence, Brazilians, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Peruvians, who seek a better future in rich countries, and who, believing they only carry their needs and hopes, also carry with them their languages, their traditions, their customs, and a unique nostalgia in the spirit of Bolero and Son and Tango, a curious nostalgia that the English, the French and the Italians do not seem to feel in their relationship with their world of origin. But what people are these who, despite their enormous diversity, are perceived by the world as a single people, and who have deserved, by one of those curious somersaults in which history is pleased, to inherit the name of one of the most illustrious traditions. Cultures of the planet, to the point of being called, generically, Latinos? To question its genesis is to peer into the most decisive of the historical facts of modernity. It is to look into the heart of the West and see an age of iron and blood that slowly and inexorably, to the rhythm of its agonies and its hopes, is changing in eloquence and in music. When we talk about the discovery of America, we tend to look at it as a historical moment and as a geographical fact, the apex of fortune in the age of discoveries, the moment in which the two faces of the planet, until then totally separated, looked at each other. First time. It is amazing to think that until just 5 centuries ago the Atlantic Ocean, which is today the route of many of our migrations, was a marine extension that had practically never been visited by human beings. Some lost dragon of those tireless travelers, the Vikings, had touched the coasts of Newfoundland, and had forgotten some silver coins in its forests, but the discovering adventure of the Norse left no trace in history. The Spanish discovery later marked the beginning of the greatest empire known until then, and made Carlos V say that in his domains the sun did not hide, because when it set over the golden mountains of California it was already dawning over the Philippine Islands, and when it was hiding in Manila it was peeking out over the last pine forests of Germany. But America was not just another point of arrival for Europeans. It was, in many ways, an extension of their civilization, and linked their destiny to the destiny of Europe in a way that was never fully fulfilled in Asia or Africa. Neither Alexander Hellenized Persia, nor Julius Caesar Romanized Egypt, nor did Rome Latinaize Carthage or Asia Minor, and the truth is that later neither the English Europeanized India and China, nor the French managed to bring the Cartesian spirit to modern times. Indo-Chinese Peninsula. Starting with the discovery, America was a vast and complex laboratory of ethnic mixtures and cultural fusions, although for a long time these convergences and these functions were outside the gaze and awareness of the great Western culture. For Europe, America meant a sudden expansion of the available territory, and the truth is that in just over 4 centuries some 100 million immigrants arrived here. Today it is our countries that send their displaced and disinherited in search of a future to more fortunate lands, but it is important not to forget that America was, in other times, the refuge of humanity, and that in our continent they found their home and their destiny. Millions of human beings exiled by hunger, wars, and tyrannies. Perhaps never in history have there been such massive displacements of human beings as those who came to America, not even when the hordes of Indo-Europeans advanced occupying Europe, nor when the Roman Empire took over the known world, nor when the Moors occupied the northern reaches of the Mediterranean, nor when the hosts of Genghis Khan swept through Asia. The Spanish occupied the Caribbean, advancing on the kingdoms of the Aztecs in 1521, the Incas in 1532 and the Chibchas in 1538. Later the Portuguese occupied the vast Brazilian region, and only a century after the discoveries, when the Caribbean, the ancient territories of the native empires, and these regions of our tierra firme were already occupied by the conquerors, the process of colonization of the territory began North American. In the United States and Canada, the native populations were practically exterminated, and therefore colonization consisted of a transfer of vast populations to a rich world that had never been exploited. In Aztec, Caribbean, Inca, Equinoctial, and Southern America, large regions preserved their majority indigenous population, all received the abundant contribution of the Iberian peoples, and others experienced the gradual incorporation of the African world, since quite possibly only from Africa were they brought to our continent, as slaves, about 15 million people. This marked the main difference between the world's north and south of the American continent. It could be said that the north became an extension of European culture, overshadowed by slavery, although renewed by the biblical sensation of populating the Promised Land, and by the Adamic consciousness of beginning a world. Nowhere does that cry of novelty, that sensation of dawn, and one might almost say, that rumor of paradise, resounds so loudly as in the work of the great poet of the New World, Walt Whitman, the son of Manhattan. Latin America, while paying tribute to Europe for 3 centuries, experienced something very different, the fusion in different degrees of the cultures of the 3 continents, which formed our first great cultural mosaic, mostly white countries of European origin, such as Argentina, Uruguay, and to some extent Chile, mostly indigenous countries, such as Mexico, Guatemala, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, predominantly mulatto countries, such as Brazil, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, or Jamaica, and mestizo countries, such as Colombia or Nicaragua, which are neither predominantly white, nor indigenous, nor African, but rather have a large number of racial and cultural mixtures. In ancient times, Rome was a vast empire, and brought to all peoples the great Latin language and to many of its inhabitants the status of civitas, of citizens. But after its fall came an age of disintegration, where each town was enclosed within its borders, the great continental routes were abandoned, the economy and politics assumed local form, and forests and roads were filled with robbers and dangerous, propitiating for centuries, thanks to isolation, the dismemberment of the common language into regional dialects. This is how Spanish arose, from the mixture of Latin with the Celt-Iberian languages, Portuguese, as a particular form of Latin on the shores of Iberia, thus emerged French, which allied Latin with the Gallic languages, thus the Tuscan arose, as a popular form of Latin in the central region of Italy, and thus the Romanian arose, from the mixture of Latin with the Slavic languages. Even English, a derivative of the Old Anglo-Saxon, was loaded with words of Latin origin, since the British Isles had been the last limit of the Roman Empire. And that is how a great language of civilization disappeared from the world, not by death, but by fragmentation into local dialects. However, the paths of history are complex and unpredictable. No one could think, in times when the Roman Empire was dying and the Romance dialects were becoming stronger, that some of them would become, 1,000 years later, once again great planetary languages. None of them have had the curious luck that the Spanish and the Portuguese had. But it is that with the information of the great Iberian Empire of Carlos V, in the 16th century, the foundations of the new economic era were also laid, when, thanks to the traffic of metals from America, world trade was born. For this reason, when the empire disintegrated, when the independence of the Ibero-American nations arrived at the beginning of the 19th century, the countries were not fully isolated as in the days of the decline of Rome, and the growing phenomenon of globalization has found us in possession of vigorous and enriched common languages. However, few stories are as exemplary as the enrichment of these languages. The Latin language had produced in Spain some of the highest literary expressions of its time, the poetic and philosophical works of Lucan and Seneca. Not surprising for a region that had also regenerated the empire politically by giving birth to the great emperors Trajan and Hadrian, who were the light of their time. But after the fall of the empire, the first great foreign contribution was the hubbub. The word Algarabia today means, for us, an incomprehensible bustle, but originally it was simply the name of the Arabic language. When Islam brought its refined architecture, its rooms with fountains, its philosophers and its dromedaries to the dryness of Granada and Córdoba, 7 centuries it projected its refinement on Christian culture, it also left the sounds of its language in the neighboring language. This influence filled Spanish poetry with a new musicality, as well as enriched philosophical possibilities that were later largely frustrated by Christian dogmatism and by the hooks of its Inquisition courts. Europe was barbaric when Islam was a refined civilization, whose physiologists established some foundations of modern medicine, whose mathematicians were the most outstanding of the time, whose philosophers Averroes and Avicenna recovered the work of Aristotle, forgotten by the West, whose storytellers brought tones fantastic and imagination excessively restricted by the church and by the village spirit. Perhaps it was a vestige of Arab poetry, which venerates musicality in language as a virtue in itself, not necessarily tributary to a meaning in the way that arabesques are pictorial music and not representation of images or ideas, which it allowed the emergence of poetic adventures such as that of Gongora, crystal weaver, and capricious verbal architect. But around the time of the discovery, the poets Juan Boscan and Garcilaso de la Vega accepted the challenge of a Venetian ambassador to bring to Spanish the musicality of the Italian language, the rhythms and forms of poetry that Petrarch had refined with his sonnets. The troubadours with their songs, and Dante with the triplets of his journey through the fetid pits of hell, through the musical rocks of purgatory and through the terraces of paradise, supported by columns of the just and the wings of angels. There began the Spanish Golden Age, which sang to love at once sensual and mystical in the voice of Saint John of the Cross, who weaved indelible thoughts with delicate music in the voice of Fray Luis de Leon, who reasoned deeply and moralized in the harmonious hendecasyllables of Quevedo, who knew how to be flexible and passionate in the verses of Lope de Vega, who built the admirable periods in his sonority and industriousness of Luis de Gongora, and who finally picked up his expressive force and his ability to testify to the time the death of an era and the birth of another, by founding in the work of Cervantes the typical literary genre of the modern age, the novel. Already with the contribution of Arabic and Italian, the language had been able to perpetuate in language the very emergence of modernity. But both Spanish and Portuguese were also faced with the greatest challenge that any language had experienced throughout history, the challenge of naming a totally unknown world. A whole continent, with its forests and its rivers, with its climates and its mountain ranges, with its peoples and its cultures, with its gods and its centuries, with its songs, its wars, and its mythologies, suddenly emerged before the disconcerted eyes of Europe, and although many in the courts of the Old World, and even among the philosophers, the literati, and the poets of the time, did not realize the magnitude of the problems and the challenges that this discovery posed for the whole of civilization, the time made much men, faced by chance with tasks that normally did not correspond to them, captured and witnessed the eruption of America in the sensibility of the West, its incorporation into the known universe, and the many themes that it opened up for the sensibility, for the imagination and for thought. There the world saw an age in which humble soldiers became great creators of language, in which merchants became storytellers, in which hungry adventurers found the poetry of blood and gold. Many historians have wondered why so few of the great sages and great writers of Europe came to live direct experience of the American world, and why they almost always had to be warriors of average culture and chroniclers of not so exquisite training. Who was given to recognize this world, describe the first clash of cultures and preserve for centuries the testimony of those auroras of blood. The world knows how to improvise its poets and its conductors when it needs them. Given the circumstances of the time, given the dogmatism and the rigors of the Inquisition, I dare to think that it was not so bad that those modest characters in their training had been the ones who wove the vast cosmos of the chronicles of the Indies and painted the bloody tapestry of the time. Perhaps the philosophers and the sages, trained in a more rigid tradition than the inexperienced scribes and the unsuspecting adventurers, would have seen less than the chroniclers did, and perhaps they would have inscribed it in a language more indolent of the formalities of the time in a less perceptive way. Many chroniclers of the Indies, like many of the authors of the Icelandic warrior sagas, took their resources from life rather than the habits of tradition, and were enormously inventive because their literary turns were often imposed by the very vertigo of the facts. The truth is that thanks to these authors, Bernal Díaz del Castillo and Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, Bartolomé de las Casas and Cieza de León, Juan de Castellanos and Fray Pedro Simon, among so many memorable witnesses of the early days of America, the substance of a world that we will never see again and the whirlwind of an unrepeatable era were saved for posterity and represented a new contribution to the process of enriching the language. But what was happening was the formation of a new world era. Due to the discovery of America, the confirmation of the roundness of the planet and the relativization of many old truths thanks to the questions that this discovery brought with it. Great sages, throughout history, had suggested and even demonstrated the roundness of the planet, but one thing is to think about it and another thing is to live it. Only at the beginning of the 16th century, humanity began to truly live in a sphere, and the conquest of the consciousness of that sphere would still be slow, since we can affirm that humanity was always capable of living, not in the fullness of a worldview, but in pieces of different worldviews, crudely assembled to produce an illusion of coherence. Only at the end of the 20th century, we could see the Catholic Church accepting the truths of Galileo, and the fact had surprising edges because the Church, undoubtedly sincere in its contrition, graciously decided to forgive Galileo, 5 centuries later, when the only sensible thing to do it would have been to apologize. So the fact that the truths are demonstrated does not guarantee that humanity really incorporates them into their daily reality, and it would seem that the world lives spontaneously in a mist mixed with certainties and fantasies, to which they often only give coherence. The myths. The gold and silver of America were decisive in the consolidation of the mercantile society. More than 20,000 tons of Mexican and Peruvian silver, and an indeterminate amount of tons of gold from New Granada and other regions, were undoubtedly a gigantic flow, which ran through the veins of Europe, and greatly contributed to the formation of modern capitalism. It is still moving to see those golden statues of the Cathedral of Seville, in which the molten gold of the solar gods of America entered the cult of the Christian God, but it was at the hands of German bankers, English pirates, and merchants of Flanders that went to stop most of that wealth that did not make a fortune in Spain. We also know that contact with American cultures, despite the barbarity with which they were destroyed, was the basis for the meditations of Bartolomé de las Casas and Francisco de Victoria, which gave rise to humanitarian law, inspired the reflections of Montaigne, one of the pillars of modernity, stimulated the elaboration of the Utopia of Thomas More. He revived the old European myths, the legend of the City of Gold, the legend of the country of the Amazons, the island of the Fountain of Eternal Youth, the reefs of the Sirens and the dream of the country of Cinnamon, that world fed, finally, in Rousseau the legend of the noble savage and the cult of nature that would inspire the dreams and landscapes of Romanticism, and that would be one of the main stimuli for the appearance of ethnology and anthropology, disciplines that have changed the sensitivity of contemporary societies. All that was, then, a fulfillment, but also a beginning. Where the task of imperial Spain ended at that time, which, as Hegel would say, because its decline was launched, there was the beginning of the American cultural adventure, but since then centuries passed before both Latin America and the Iberian Peninsula returned. Find yourself at the heart of the story. I dare not say that this has fully occurred. I believe that our cultures are preparing for a great future, and I believe that the centuries we have lived through have been centuries of complex and disproportionate gestation, but it is already possible to see that ours has ceased to be a marginal region of the world, and not insist on long historical recounts. I simply want to reflect on some isolated elements. A very important one is that despite the enormous political and economic fragmentation of our countries, it is possible to notice that every time great cultural movements arise, they appear simultaneously throughout the continent. When the enlightened generation that prepared independence arose, when the battles for freedom were fought, the destinies of great men of these lands were continental destinies. That generation of Latin American patriots moved the world, and there is no doubt that at the beginning of the 19th century, our countries formed an outstanding part of world history. It is not only because we find the statue of Bolivar on the Alexander III Bridge in Paris, or in the center of a square in Cairo, or in the Central Park of New York. It is not only because in the encyclopedic recounts of the great events of the millennium, not because they are slightly less significant, it is noted that the two great moments of Latin America that appear are the Age of Conquest and the Age of Independence. It is evident that, although America was incorporated into world history since the discovery, and was already inconceivable since then without the contribution of Europe and Africa, only in the last years of the 18th century, and in the first years of the 19th, did it seem to become aware from its cosmic location, and seem to make the decision to take destiny into its own hands. You have to listen to the way Bolivar spoke to perceive the magnitude of his historical consciousness and the fine perception he had of his time and the way we belonged to the world. We are a small humankind, Bolivar wrote in the letter to Jamaica. We possess a world apart, surrounded by vast seas, new in almost all the arts and sciences, though somewhat old in the usages of civil society. I consider the current state of America, like when the Roman Empire collapsed, each dismemberment formed a political system, according to their interests and situations or following the particular ambition of some chiefs, families, or corporations, with this remarkable difference, that those scattered members returned to re-establish their ancient nations with the alterations that things or events demanded, plus us, who barely conserve vestiges of what was once, and who on the other hand are not Indians or Europeans, but a middle species between the legitimate owners of the country and the Spanish usurpers. In short, being Americans by birth and our rights are those of Europe, we have to dispute these with those of the country, and that we maintain ourselves in it against the invasion of the invaders. Thus we find ourselves in the most extraordinary and complicated case, despite the fact that it is a kind of divination to indicate what will be the result of the policy line that America follows. I dare to venture some conjectures, which, of course, I characterize as arbitrary, dictated by a rational desire and not by probable reasoning. Like Humboldt, one of the things that most worried Bolívar was the tremendous inequality that was inherited from the colony. In almost two countries, indigenous peoples had been stripped of their rich tradition, of their awareness of being at the center of a world, of their dignity, and hastily turned into worshippers of a mental order in which they would never be seen in conditions of equality. Due to their tremendous arrogance, the crown, the businessmen, and the church were willing to have subjects, to have servants and to have faithful, but not to allow a process of dignity of human beings to take place here, and even less of exaltation of free beings capable of discretion and judgment. For centuries the Catholic Church would continue to prohibit free reading in America, which had been the instrument of the Enlightenment to build a citizen's conscience and a responsible individual capable of sustaining the scaffolding of the republics. Bolívar continually questioned himself about how to found a political order in which the serfs and slaves had access to freedom, the discriminated Creoles had access to equality, and both had access to fraternity, principles that were so eloquently proclaimed in France by the canons of the Revolution. But if it was difficult in Paris to make the French accede to liberty, equality, and fraternity, in Paris, where everyone was part of a homogeneous nation with more than 4 centuries of unified existence, united by a long tradition, what to expect from peoples made up of Indians, Creoles, and blacks, mestizos, mulattoes and zambos? What to expect from those Creoles more willing to gain notoriety and power than to live with the mulatto and the Indianata? What to expect from those remnants of the old native cultures? What to do with these syncretic religions? What to do with the rich patriots who were willing to fight for independence, but not to give freedom to their many slaves? What do you do with those miners and landowners who lived by shipping their metals and products from Spain? What to do with those merchants who lived from trade with the metropolises? What to do with those who had learned the 1,000 nuances of the bureaucratic trap, with the already flourishing tradition of devious legalism, that empire of lawyers who tightened and retightened the nuts of the law to thrive on its gaps and parasitize from its ambiguities? It is known that many indigenous people resisted the idea of independence because they rightly feared that the mestizos who would take over the states could become more exclusive and more contemptuous of the Indians, blacks, and mulattoes than the Spaniards themselves. Also in his time, many slaves rejected the incomprehensible idea that slavery should be abolished, since without extensive and long-term educational and social work to change values, build an ethic of equality, and effectively offer educational opportunities, political, legal and economic, the freedom of the slaves was limited, as Estanislao Zuleta has said, to leaving them free of food and shelter. The path that Bolívar saw was the path of generosity. He believed in the need for a slow and paternal pedagogical work that would teach races, social classes, regions, and traditions to coexist, promoting the best of all of them and establishing that creative dialogue within the framework of rich legislation. In guarantees, which would allow them to overcome in a short time the trauma of a century of savage conquests and 2 centuries of colonial arrogance. I desire more than any other to see America form the greatest nation in the world, less because of its size and riches than because of its freedom and glory. Although I aspire to the perfection of the government of my country, I cannot persuade myself that the New World is for the moment governed by a great republic. Since it is impossible, I do not dare to wish for it, and I even less wish for a universal monarchy in America, because this project, without being useful, is also impossible. the abuses that currently exist would not be reformed and our regeneration would be fruitless. The American states have needed the care of paternal governments to heal the wounds of despotism and war. Just as there had always been a Caribbean America, an Andean America and an Amazon America, an America of the deserts of the north and an America of the pampas of the south, a white America, an Indian America and a black America had also been defined. Or better yet, a predominantly white Euro-America, like Argentina or Chile, an indigenous and mestizo Indo-America, in Mexico, Guatemala, Ecuador, Peru or Bolivia, a predominantly black and mulatto Afro-America, in Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, or Brazil. This did not mean that all the countries were not mestizo to a greater or lesser degree, but many elements that characterized their cultures derived from that original composition. Each of these Americas would have unique elements to contribute to the mosaic of civilization, and it was impossible for the solution of these conflicts to come about through the almost magical discovery of a political system suited to their needs. All political systems are the fruit of tradition and experience, and Mestizo America was a new experiment in world history. The conquest of its formal independence would be just the first step in a long search that required the experiment of social coexistence within the framework of new legislation, economic strengthening governed by the ideal of autonomy and cultural independence. Simon Rodriguez rightly said that we would only find solutions when we did not think of ourselves as different from one country to another and when we did not believe in more borders than the natural ones of the continent. 2 centuries later, these conditions for the existence of the continent as a solidary nation with firm commitments and with shared responsibilities regarding the destiny of the world have not yet been fully met, but despite the apparent chaos, we have come a long way. Miscegenation, which was our great difficulty, is also our great opportunity on the stage of contemporary culture, since the tendency towards miscegenation and militage is one of the main characteristics of modernity. The world no longer has towards any form of racial or cultural purity, but towards all kinds of fusions. This explains the value of mestizo cultures as full faces of the time. Their challenges are the most compelling since, faced with the persistent danger of fascism, which claims to claim the superiority of pure races, pure languages, single religions, or homogeneous cultures, and which absurdly seek to impose them on the entire world, the only alternative is to find the value of the mergers and show the mestizo civilization as the most likely face of the future. Thus, our countries, on which the hegemonic power of certain cultures carried out so many atrocities and so much violence, have been forced before any other to be the laboratories of this new planetary age. That is what the ideology of that great man of action and great dreamer of futures who was the liberator Bolivar pointed to, from a time when neither ethnology nor anthropology had given cultures their vindication and justification. There is in his ideas more of a kind of dark intuition than a precise conceptual development. Brotherhood by tradition and language, perhaps the day will not be far away when the still vague dream of a unity of nations of our America will be fulfilled, as outlined in those final words of the letter from Jamaica. It is a grandiose idea to try to form from the entire New World a single nation with a single bond that links its parts to each other and to the whole. Since it has an origin, a language, some customs, and a religion, it should, therefore, have a single government that would confederate the different states that are to be formed, but it is not possible, because remote climates, remote situations, diverse situations, opposing interests, dissimilar characters, divide America. How beautiful it would be if the Isthmus of Panama were for us what that of Corinth was for the Greeks. Hopefully one day we will have the fortune to install there an august Congress of the representatives of the republics, kingdoms, and empires to treat and discuss the high interests of peace and war, with the nations of the other parts of the world. This kind of corporation may take place at some happy time of our regeneration. Another hope is unfounded, similar to that of the Abbé St. Pierre, who conceived the laudable delusion of convening a European Congress to decide on the fate and interests of those nations. In our time, however, we have seen how the states of Europe, much more different from each other, and traditionally more opposed by wars, religious conflicts, and cultural differences, have reached the gates of a confederation. At the end of the 19th century, another admirable generation took up the challenge of seeking our entrance into modernity. It was also there in the field of language, and in particular of literature, where this effort was made to break the rigid schemes of societies that had lost their planetary vocation and had locked themselves in their lethargic dream of villages, sometimes idyllic, but often violent and fratricidal. In Mexico, in Havana, in Bogotá, in Lima, in Santiago de Chile, in Buenos Aires, the renewing voices of Manuel Gutiérrez Nájera, José Martí, José Asunción Silva, José María Eguren, Ricardo James Freire, Leopoldo Lugones began to emerge. His themes, his rhythms, the grace of his language, the elasticity of his cadences, the richness of his prose, made it possible to glimpse that a true revolution in sensibility was taking place there. Two simultaneous facts were remarkable: one, the continental character of his adventure and his search; another, the fact that they all seemed to draw from the same sources, from the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe and Heinrich Heine, but mainly from contemporary French poetry, from the voices of Victor Hugo, Baudelaire, and especially Paul Verlaine. An extraordinarily musical poet, given to passion and disorder, but full of life, grace, and authenticity. Paul Verlaine, drunk, selfish, turbulent, unstable, but vigorous, delicate, passionate and brilliant, was a sort of remote portrait of the state of mind of the Ibero-American writers of the end of the century. They learned many things from him. Thanks to their influence they transformed the language, made it more expressive, more harmonious, more nuanced, more irreverent and more sensual. What was coming to us was a language for passion that was contained in countries full of cultural richness and human diversity, but silenced for a long time by colonialism and later by the narrow-mindedness of a village politics. Now we were poking our heads back to the reality of the planet. The most prominent member of that literary generation, the Nicaraguan Rubén Darío, not only brought many of the partial conquests of his friends and colleagues to fruition in verse and prose, but was also the one chosen by destiny to bring to Spain the evidence of this adventure of modernity. When he arrived in Madrid in 1898, Spain had just lived through its war with the United States. It had lost its last possessions in the Caribbean, the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico, its last possessions in the Pacific, the Philippine Islands, and with them it had lost the last vestiges of his world empire. The old Spanish literary generations succumbed to prostration in a disenchanted country, but the new ones were eager to meet the world and to build a modern Spain, adapted to the times, capable of fully living the new adventure of no longer being an empire almost fictitious, but one of the most original nations of Europe. There Rubén Darío found those young people, Antonio Machado and Miguel de Unamuno, Juan Ramón Jiménez and Ramón del Valle Inclán, also great readers of French, renovators of sensitivity, eager for the future. That meeting bore great fruit, and just as the generation of Latin American modernists had found in Dario's sensitivity, talent, and generosity the ideal spokesperson to represent them before Spain, the new Spanish writers found in him their best emissary for America. Rubén Darío thus became not only the symbol of Latin American modernism, but also the symbol of an unexpected convergence of the two wings of language, on both sides of the Atlantic. And it is because that contact occurred, because at that lucky moment that dialogue was possible, that the Spanish language, which had spent 2 centuries almost in silence in which the rest of the great languages of Europe lived the splendor of their creativity, the centuries of classicism, rationalism, and romanticism, and had ceased to be an instrument of the great adventures of the spirit, rediscovered its destiny as a great language of civilization, and undertook throughout the 20th century the adventure that has made it not only in the third language of the world, after Mandarin and English by quantity, but in one of the most vigorous of modern times, one of the languages that will have to assume, in a leading way on the planet, the responsibility for the future, the tasks of reflection, creation, and communication that open up before us at this crossroads of centuries. In 1936, the great Mexican writer and thinker Alfonso Reyes spoke at an international forum, and published in the magazine Sur, of Buenos Aires, some reflections on the way in which our elders perceived their destiny as children of this continent. The immediate generation that precedes us still believed that it was born inside the prison of various concentric fatalities. The most pessimistic felt this way: first, the first great fatality, which of course consisted in being human, according to the sentence of the old Silenus collected by Calderon, because the greatest crime of man is to have been born. Within this, came the second circle, which consisted of having arrived very late in an old world. The echoes of that romanticism that the Cuban Juan Clemente Zanilla summarizes in 2 verses had not yet died out: my times are those of ancient Rome, and my brothers with Greece have died. In the world of our letters, a sentimental anachronism dominated the average people. It was the third circle, on top of the misfortunes of being human and being modern, the very specific one of being American, that is, born and rooted in a soil that was not the current focus of civilization, but a branch of the world. To use a word of our Victoria Ocampo, the grandparents felt owners of a soul without a passport. And since one was American, another handicap in the race of life was being Latino, or, in short, having a Latino cultural background. It was the time of a quotient la superiorite des Anglo-Saxons. It was the time of submission to the present state of things, without hope of definitive change or faith in redemption. Only Rodó's harangues were heard, noble and candid. Since it belonged to the Latin world, a new fatality within it belonged to the Hispanic world. The old lion had been down for a long time. Spain seemed to be back from its former greatness, skeptical and helpless. The sun had set on his domain. And, to make matters worse, Hispanic Americans did not understand each other with Spain, as was the case until recently, even before the present pain of Spain, which wounds us all. Within the Hispanic world we still come to be a dialect, a derivation, a secondary thing, a branch again, the Hispanic American, a name that is tied with a hyphen, as if with a chain. Among Hispanic Americans, those close to me still lamented having been born in an area loaded with Indians. The Indian, then, was a burden, and not yet a haughty duty and a strong hope. Within this region, those who are still closest to me had reason to grieve at having been born in the fearful neighborhood of a thriving and plethoric nation, a feeling now transformed into the priceless honor of representing the front of a race. Of all these ghosts that the wind has been carrying away or the light of day has been redrawing until they have become, at least, acceptable realities, something still remains in the corners of America, and it must be pursued by opening the windows wide and calling superstition by its name, which is the way to drive it away. But, in substance, all this is already rectified. Ceded the previous premises and after this examination of cause, I dare to assume a style of legal allegation. There has been a feeling of leveling and equality between Spain and us for a long time. And now I say before the tribunal of international thinkers that is listening to me, we recognize the right to universal citizenship that we have already won. We have reached the age of majority. Very soon you will get used to counting on us. So far the text of Alfonso Reyes. I dare to affirm that that time has come, and Alfonso Reyes himself is one of the forgers of this age in which the specific way of thinking and the very diverse style of creation of our cultures has begun to become indispensable for the world. The 20th century was the century in which Ibero-America went from invisibility and remoteness to being at the center of the dramas of the contemporary world, but also at the center of its spiritual adventures. No one can ignore that our current presence in the international arena is profoundly marked by the difficulties inherent to our reality, by the persistence of very modern evils. No one can ignore the existence of drug trafficking, terrorism, political and economic exile. But these facts must not be allowed to overshadow or annul another great truth, that of the vigor and growing relevance of our cultures, the way in which we are reinterpreting Western tradition, and the unmistakable flavor that our creations already have. It is impossible to conceive the literature of the 20th century without thinking, among many others, of Jorge Luis Borges, João Guimarães Rosa, Pablo Neruda, Juan Rulfo, or Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Each one of them not only represents the expression of a region, of a sensitivity, one of the irreplaceable faces of this kind of Latin planet. Borges, voice of a country of immigrants, encrypts in his works the cosmopolitanism of America, its infinite curiosity for all cultures, its right to inherit all traditions, its cult for the accumulated memory of libraries and symbols, and at the same time, his Adamic perplexity for a world that is always unexplained, the point at which art and philosophy are linked to produce, not certainties that overwhelm and silence, but privileged states of amazement and gratitude. Rolfo, voice of an apparently abolished indigenous world, gives rise in his poetry to the spectral rumor of a reality where life and death intertwine, where time is at the same time a breath of wakefulness and sleep, in where intimacy and history dialogue in the stark language of elementary emotions. Neruda and Gimeri's Roses show us the turbulence of a world where nature still exists in a sense that many regions of the planet have already lost, a nature that language besieges and never fully reaches. They show us the eternal American adventure of trying to name, with a language that is always insufficient, a world of excessive fertility and powerful violence, and they reveal to us how urgent the task of incorporating the nameless and the unknown into the order of the sacred and the human. The central task of all poetry. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, voice of the multiple universe of the Caribbean, fuses the musicality of the Spanish language with the disconcerting magical thinking of indigenous peoples and with the joy and sensuality of African cultures, to produce the splendor of the mestizo novel, the saga of a world where perhaps only the complicity of forbidden love manages to survive the tricks of language, the arbitrariness of power and the winds of doom. If these authors, and so many others, have made their way into the hearts of their contemporaries throughout the world, it is because the syntheses that Alfonso Reyes mentioned have not ceased to occur in our culture, because Ibero-America is beginning to have answers for the world, and it will have them more and more to the extent that it assumes all its wealth, the wisdom and the sum of knowledge of its indigenous peoples, the vigor, joy, and sense of rhythm of its African-American peoples. The deep imprint of civilizations from its Iberian and Latin past, and the growing contribution of the cultures that have come to us to stay. We can affirm that Ibero-America has entered into a dialogue of equality with the world in the field of culture. Perhaps it will not be long before this cultural exchange will also become a true economic and political exchange, and something much more important and more urgent, in a dialogue, on equal terms with the rest of the world, on the directions of human civilization and the future of the planet. Finish. The new centers of the sphere. William Ospina.